Hello. So today I wanted to share a bit about a kind of unfolding experience that's happened for me. It's this bit of this bit of philosophy that has been a real lived challenge for me around something like how good is existence? It's like it might seem very abstract, but there's something very practical here. Um, I think giving a little bit of historical context, I think, is useful, as this is a very, very old problem. Lots of people have grappled with this. Hey, Sam. Um, so this is often called the problem of evil. I feel like I've had something click for me about it that has created a lot of something like a mix of relief and fear, but it's fear that I like the fear of feeling this ratcheting going up a roller coaster, and as it tips over the top, there's oh, I signed up for this. Okay. But the problem of evil, or originally, at least in the Western tradition, comes from theology, from questions of puzzling over the nature of God and one's relationship to God. So the the classic Western way of articulating the problem of evil is, well, God is supposed to be all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving, and yet there's evil in the world. How do we reconcile that? This, uh, for the most part, the Westernized world has resolved this by saying there is no God. Evil just is. This was this is a very practical problem for the Jews in the wake of World War II. A lot of them looked around and said, how could God have chosen this to happen to his chosen people? And a lot of Jews became atheists. This is why there's a whole arc. I don't know if you've encountered this or how widespread the awareness is of this, but there's a really big trend. It's been going on for, strangely, about the last 70 years. Uh, for there to be a lot of atheist Jewish scholars. So they're culturally Jewish, they're educated in Jewish context, but they don't believe in God. Maybe they keep on some of the practices sort of the same way that most Americans still put up a Christmas tree. Actually, I don't know about most, but quite a lot of Americans put up a Christmas tree, even if they don't believe in Jesus, and even if they even if they don't have any particular attitudes towards Odin. Most America has no idea that the Christmas tree, as far as I know, has its origins in Norse mythology. It is a reflection of Yggdrasil, the world tree. It was a homage to Odin, the king of the Norse gods, the tree that he hung on in order to bring language in the form of runes to the world. And it was also a signification of there is still life in the world, and we are honoring the Yggdrasil, the eternal life, in hopes and in recognition of the sun coming back. So that's, I may have been misinformed, but that's a lot of the arc of the Christmas tree. And most Americans don't know about that, much less care, but we still put up a Christmas tree. So in the same kind of way, a lot of Jews aren't Jewish, depending on what you mean by the word Jewish, not religiously Jewish. But this ultimately comes from the arc of the problem of evil. And one very simple answer to that question is there is no God. Which is to say, there is evil, there is no God, that's why there's no paradox. Okay, great. But this doesn't actually avoid the problem of evil. It just avoids the problem of evil as it has been articulated. So there's another version that I encounter in very secular circles. I just don't often recognize it like this. This is, so one way that this gets expressed is, so for the most generic form is, ignorance is bliss. which is to say, like one version I've encountered is, man, if learning all this stuff about like the physics and the philosophy of the world bumps you into nihilism, maybe it's just better not to know. This has also been the general Western answer to the meaning crisis. We've been looking around at the pit of nihilism left in the wake of the victory of the scientific paradigm. Like most of us in practice in the westernized world have some general trend towards believing, okay, there is an objective material world and it generally follows principles of science. There's some disagreement about the details, and some people create pockets of meaning by really believing in this religion or that belief system or this meaning-making method. But they all try to argue with each other. Not all of them, but there's a whole cluster of chaos that goes on there. The general Western culture answer to this meaning crisis, where the scientific paradigm says nothing matters, it's just moving laws of physics that have no meaning, we create this hallucination of meaning and life and love and so on. All the things that matter to us are extra things that the universal laws don't care about. And if all of humanity were to be obliterated, the universe wouldn't blink, it wouldn't care. Nothing you do actually matters. Nothing you do can ever matter. You can only have the illusion of mattering because we're all hallucinating this thing as a social construct, but the social doesn't even exist in any real sense. It's a pretty bleak view if you dig into it. I don't agree with it, but that's the worldview that the Western, like the Western victory over the physical world builds upon this foundation. Builds upon a foundation, rather, that has this as an implication. And that's part of why it systematically attacked religion, which is why we end up in an atheist world. It's not a coincidence that atheism and ignorance is bliss came together. Because the atheist answer to the problem of evil only treats the problem of evil at a very surface level. It's looking at it as, if there is a really nice, powerful, wise demiurge, if there is a being who sort of watches over everything, there is a creator who creates the world, or rules over the world or something, and is really nice and powerful and sees everything, and but there's still bad stuff. How do we reconcile that? Oh, well, clearly there isn't such a floating being. But yeah, this doesn't dig deep enough. And a version that I encountered in rationalist circles is, what if the truth drives you mad? This is like a Lovecraftian twist. What if the human mind actually breaks in the face of certain truths? It just can't process it. But it can't unsee it either because it's true. It's a correct update. It's a correct input. And so in that case, the ability to live a life requires living a lie. So, and this is not too unfeasible. It's quite possible that the human mind just evolved in a context that happened to be restricted because we only get information through our senses. We have these detectors that evolved in order to let these chunks of meat basically go around and get food and avoid poison and run from predators, and it became more and more complicated, but it was just touching on enough of the world to be able to do the next step. Oh, if you don't develop this step, then you all die. Ones that develop this step proliferate really well. There's no basic thing there isn't an intelligence in biological evolution that says, let's try to attune to truth. It's just a mechanical reaction to, well, let me be better fit to reality as it is than the next guy, and then I do better than the next guy, which means I have more kids. And since I pass on what I'm doing to my kids, this means that this tendency spreads. That's evolution. So it's actually very plausible that the human mind, which is basically a processing system for dealing with the senses and creating movement in the body. There's a very mechanical way of describing it. It's very within the scientific materialist paradigm. It's perfectly feasible. I'm just pointing out, within the scientific materialist paradigm, that which is beyond the human mind, or is even beyond the scientific materialist paradigm, but is still real according to that paradigm. Means it's part of the paradigm, but it might very well be there, and it's just something that the human mind has not evolved to handle. And it could choke the same way that computer viruses can make a computer choke. The same way that an anvil dropped on somebody's head tends to make them not think as clearly. That's real. It was a real input. It's not as silly an analogy as you might think. It's just information. And death is a very common response to overwhelm of information that a human mind can't handle. Arguably, that's all death ever is, depending on what you mean by information. So, in this condition, it seems like it's important, there's an argument to make about, well, maybe rather than just expanding our knowledge, it's actually important to expand our knowledge within safe parameters. We seem to be able to think about mathematics. We don't know what math is. We don't know where it's coming from. That's kind of scary. Gödel's incompleteness theorem throws a monkey wrench in the whole thing, but let's not look at that. That is actually the mathematician's general response for the most part. Gödel's incompleteness theorem came in, destroyed the foundations of mathematics as people had been thinking about it, and for the most part they said, well, if we do this, we don't violate the theorem anymore, and so let's just use set theory and ignore the fact that it's incomplete and just run with it. I'm doing a little bit of an injustice to the mathematical community by saying it that way, but not as much as you might think. Most mathematicians don't care that the foundations of math are incomplete, and necessarily so. They are necessarily incomplete. They just go, well, great, it's incomplete, but I can discover this thing over here in this corner, sort of implicitly because this corner is safe. A lot of the logicians and mathematicians who were really struggling with the foundations of math at the turn of the 20th century literally went insane. Right? If I remember right, Gödel of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It's fine if you don't know what these theorems are. As Samuel, the theorem is Gödel's incompleteness theorem. G umlaut O D E L. The theorem the theorem basically says that in any system that's complicated enough to count, quite literally, that's complicated enough to include counting numbers, that you can construct a statement that says, this statement is unprovable. Which means either it's true, and therefore you can't prove it, or it's false and you can. So, which is to say, it's proof by example that every system that is intricate enough to be able to model certainly our world and to model complex systems is going to have true statements that it can't prove, or it will be able to derive a contradiction and therefore can prove pretty much everything. So Kurt Gödel, the person who created Gödel's incompleteness theorem, there are multiple theorems, but what I just said wraps up what I think is the philosophical important part of it. Kurt Gödel, if I remember right, died of starvation due to a paranoid delusion that someone was trying to poison him. Okay. Georg Cantor, who's one of the people who helped to build some of the foundations of set theory that are currently still used, it looks like he went into full-blown schizophrenia, schizophrenic delusions, and became psychotic, like truly clinically psychotic. So like this is there's something to be said about, oh, maybe peering into the foundations of reality and truth might actually break the human mind in certain ways. Hmm. So there's like there's logical room for concern here. In practice, I don't think this is something to worry about, and I'll get to that in a moment. So this is, I think, another version of the problem of evil, where the thing is basically, it looks like reality is unsafe, that reality has bad things in it. Maybe exposing myself to reality too much will expose me to bad things. So, is truth trustworthy to me as a person? That conundrum, the fact that we need truth in order to fit to reality well, but there's a feeling of, well, obviously some things about reality are actually a threat. Right? And maybe it can break my ability to fit to anything at all. How do we deal with that? That, I think, is another version of the problem of evil. Maybe ignorance is bliss. Maybe living a good life consists of giving up on truth and just being happy. And sure, maybe I'll die someday, but I don't want to pay attention to that, because that doesn't make me happy. It's absolutely a consistent way to live. I don't think it's possible, because there is a very basic drive in human beings for truth. Right? Quick thought experiment about this. This is something John Vervaeke passed on in some of his videos in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. The experiment goes, suppose that you, suppose that it turns out that your parents, well, maybe like you have to make adjustments for this. Suppose that everybody who claims to love you actually is providing kind of a faux illusion, that everything is sort of fabricated, that they're just actors. Like one day, some of your friends go up saying, "Hey, you know, you've reached the right age, so let us show you something." They open up a panel and they show this whole room where they're like, it's almost like you're in the Truman Show or something like that, or in the Matrix. And they're going, "Okay, so like we're just actors, or we're programs. We don't actually care about you. We're not going to change our attitudes towards you in any way, but we're going to, but it's time for you to know." Okay? So you notice, like I think most people can notice if they think about that their sense of like having a partner who turns out, you know, I don't actually care about you, but I'll play along and I'll act and give all the same behavior. There's like something still changes because of the attitude, the experience of the other. And so part of the question then is, well, suppose that this is what's true, like that this kind of illusion is happening in the background, but it hasn't been revealed yet. Would you want to know? Right? And so now this gets to something that to me feels a lot more at the core, which is like there's a slight shift to the thought experiment. Like for most people, there's a sense of, yeah, I'd want to know. Sort of like, yeah, like if my partner cheated on me, I would want to know about it, even though it would destroy our relationship. Even if even if her cheating on me would be like she could cheat on me and then come back and then we could have a fine relationship, there's still a way where I would want to know. Like, well, what's with the want to know, even if it destroys the relationship? The reason is that the lived relationship is false. But here's where things get a little complicated. Suppose that you have a situation like that, where you don't know if your partner is cheating on you. In fact, maybe it hasn't occurred to you. Maybe you don't know, well, not just it had, I want to see how to, I want to clarify this a little bit. There's a particular feeling that I want to highlight, because there's a particular way that parts of the mind can become allergic to the willingness to look at truth. I want to highlight exactly what this looks like. If there might be something in your life that is like the case with the partner cheating, or is like the partners and family and parents and so on, all just being actors. If there's something like, if there might be something like that, but there might not be. Okay? But if you push this button, there's a little, imagine a little box with a button on it. It's attached to some kind of device electronically, and somehow, if you push this button, if there is something like that, you will come to recognize it. You don't know what domain of your life. You don't know what it will disrupt. All you know is that you get truth. Do you want to press the button? That gets a little trickier. Because at least with the partner, I know it's the relationship that gets destroyed. I don't get to know it gets destroyed by some unknown truth coming in. And then one step farther, what if you hear there is such a button? How much work do you want to put into finding it? Okay. So if the answer is anything less than a full-bodied, resonant everything, I want that button. I want the truth. I want it all. Please. I want out of any kind of delusion. It's important that it's not, I need to get out of this. Like not a panicked thing, but I mean like a full-bodied, full-throated, I am a yes to this. Okay. If it's anything less coherent than that, that means there is a part of the energetic system that fears truth and is trying to avoid it. That would prefer a fantasy over reality because the current fantasy is safer, more familiar, has some kind of game that gets some kind of pleasure out of it, that there is some kind of threat of the unknown. Okay. Samuel pops in and says, I helped create the relationship. If I know what is wrong with it, I learn more about myself. I have a harder time believing that I helped create the mechanics of the universe. Mm-hmm. Sure. I didn't say, I want to emphasize that for the sake of this thought experiment, for the sake of feeling into this, I'm not talking about, if you push this button, you learn something about something that might, like, somewhere that might be kind of like this. Like, hey, that guy over there is living a matrix life. Right? That, or the laws of physics, it turns out, are actually governed by goblins. Like that doesn't shake to the core the same kind of way that it would to recognize something like, oh, all the people in my life are actually androids. Right? That has a very different kind of shift. So what I'm talking about is something that would affect your own personal interaction with reality. Right? So I think it's really important to feel into the essence of what this thought experiment is for, rather than getting too lost in the details of the logic of it. Okay. So what I'm inviting anyone watching this into is paying attention to the somatic emotional relationship to truth. And wherever there is an inclination to prefer something else, that's it. Okay. So I've been feeling a kind of bubbling in myself, grappling with this. I had an experience in Bufo, which is a form of 5-MeO-DMT that it really exemplified something that I've encountered in a bunch of meditations and sometimes spontaneously while doing yoga. But this is just really easily the worst experience of my life. Easily. um, the the experience included, and I talked about this with Carissa a couple of weeks ago in this series. I don't remember the number, but if you look back earlier in this video series, you'll see it. The first conversation I had in this series. There's an encounter with allness, like all, like I think beyond time, an experience of infinite bliss and infinite horror and infinite nothingness and being dead and eternal life and all of it all together, but also perfectly distinct. I mean, also each one separately, but all of it all at the same time, but also all of it together, just and constantly moving, but constantly eternally still. All of everything all at once. Right? So, encountering that, it seems like, well, of course, everything would have to be everything. Like, obviously, there is an experience of horror. There are things that happen to people, or rather that people experience, that are quite miserable. I've certainly experienced things that are quite miserable. So that has to be part of what exists. So when trying to square this with some spiritual teachings that go through things like, when you actually fully see the true nature of reality, there is boundless bliss. There's a part of me that goes, yeah, it also seems like there's boundless horror too. Why should reality cater to the preferences of humans, or even to me? Like, why? Because I'm God? I mean, sure. But also because I'm God, I can also experience infinite horror and I get a kick out of it. But part of the getting a kick out of it is the way that I absolutely detest it, because that's what it is. Yeah. So what's all this business of boundless bliss? Like one of the names in spiritual yoga for God is Satchitananda, which is like three Sanskrit words smashed together that, if you look at them separately, are truth, bliss, or sorry, truth, consciousness, and bliss. Sat, Chit, Ananda. Okay, why bliss? What's with bliss? So, this morning I encountered a reminder of the same thing. I'm currently digging a bit more into something that calls itself authentic Kabbalah. I looked into esoteric Kabbalah, which is the sort of European wizardry borrows from Jewish mysticism. Most of the time, well, I'm not sure how to describe where this gestures towards, but anyway, there's a corner of esoteric philosophy that I got interested in, but then discovered there's a piece missing that I really want. Like, I'm very curious about, and I can't seem to find here. So I went into what I thought were the traditional origins, and that's in the Jewish mysticism. Although it insists it's not mysticism, or that it's Jewish, which is a little funny. But anyway, history aside, this morning I was reading through some of it, and one of the things brought up is this vision, which I find it's very clean, it's very simple. It points out this whole business that I was gesturing towards before, about how there's reality, and then there's what each of us experience, like what we experience, which is through, for instance, the gates of our senses. Our senses actually filter out. They detect, but they simplify what we encounter. We're not actually seeing light. We are in some sense, but the light that hits our eyes stimulates nerves, and nerves give an impulse. Going back to the visual cortex does some computation and then creates an impression. The purpose of that impression is a kind of hallucination that may have, surely it has some relationship to the true reality that we cannot directly experience through our senses. But that relationship isn't, this cup is really here because I can see it. Like I mean, clearly there's something going on that results in the experience of the cup. But what that is precisely that which we cannot directly experience, at least through our senses. So the point in Kabbalah is noticing that, well, the program that filters these senses. I'm going to do jazz a little bit with their concepts. Let me say it. There's something that I extract from what they're saying. So it's a mix of what I think they're saying and what I think is a way of saying what I think they mean. So injecting a little bit here. The program that interprets all of that is basically a survival system. And it's trying to get the system of the senses to move towards pleasure and away from pain. And part of that has to do with how much of reality it's blocking out, not just what it's detecting. So there's something to be said about the art of increasing your sensitivity, the sensitivity of the senses, but also expanding sensory capacity. In Kabbalah, they talk about developing a sixth sense, which is not the same thing as telepathy or clairvoyance or whatever, but a sense of truth, basically, or something like a preference for truth, a desire for truth. And using that to do some kind of syncing up. Like this gets a little messy. I feel like there's a part that they make a big deal out of that I don't particularly want to get into right now. And then it's but the point of that is to cultivate kind of a desire to experience reality more fully. And the question is, well, why would this machine want to? How would it be good for its survival? The claim is that all of these experiences that this machine, which we normally experience as ourselves, the things that it experiences as suffering and limitation and lack, and how getting something that we desire is at best temporarily fulfilling. Like, you smell really wonderful food, and then you eat some, and after each bite, you want it less. So there's some satisfaction, but the satisfaction passes, and after eating it, you then are full. And then maybe you need to go to the bathroom, or you have a meeting to go to. Or there isn't ongoing, boundless satisfaction. Satisfaction is more like crossing a threshold, and then it fades. So the dissatisfying nature, what Buddhists would call unsatisfactoriness of all of experience, is a product of this box and the way that this box is working. So to have boundless bliss, and this is the place where I go, wait, where did this come from? To have boundless bliss, you want to have more experience of boundless reality, because all of existence is reality trying to, if you want to anthropomorphize it, trying to create a creature and fill it with boundless delight. And I pause at that point and I go, or boundless horror? Why delight? Why the good thing? So it's funny giving half an hour of context. It's a gnarly puzzle. It's one that I've been grappling with for a long time. It's variations on how do I actually prefer truth? And in some sense, this is the same question, but do I want to come to prefer truth? I can see a lot of logical reasons why doing anything else is kind of dangerous or bad or unhealthy. I can see why it systematically produces suffering, but it also seems like there are some truths I might not want. Okay? And then at a meta level, I'm stuck with sort of a meta level version of the problem of evil, which is, if I ended up in a situation where I'm having to make this choice, is the thing that gave me that choice really attending to what I want? Doesn't look like it. So why should I trust it? So this is the place where I land on a puzzle. I've been wrestling with this puzzle for quite a while. But this morning, something connected for me. And it's been creating a lot of relief and this sense of excitement and a sense of, I think I understand why choosing to die makes sense. I mean, metaphorically speaking, but getting a little lost in my head. In some sense, I'm thinking, oh, maybe I should have focused on mind shatter. If you watch my eyes, I've mentioned this in a number of videos, but you can watch my eyes to tell how here I am. And if what I'm saying comes across as confusing, you can often tell whether I'm coming across as confusing because I'm in another world, basically by just watching my eyes. I think it's a pretty universal trick for human beings. So what occurred to me is a piece of logic that feels like it's actually starting to dialogue with the part in my body that is scared. The logic, like, this is just the glimmer of it, so don't take this as a fully formed argument. This is definitely, excuse me, as I've said some of the times in this series, this is an edge for me. This is something where I'm going, this is a point of growth. Okay. I think it makes sense to change what I want so that it matches reality. So there's a question of, well, can I? How much can I? But that is part of what is real. Like what is possible for me to change about my desires is part of the parameters of what is real. So if there are parts of my desire that want something other than what is real, and I can't change it, then that's part of what is true. And so this experience is something that I want to bring my question of, well, can I come to want this? Can I fully own wanting this if it's true? Can I want whatever the result is of pushing those buttons? Right? Part of what excites me about this is that to the extent that I can come to prefer exactly what is, horror and all, it means that more exposure to reality becomes ever more blissful. It means that my pleasure-seeking circuitry will move me towards truth, and that movement towards truth will allow the system of me to become better fitted to reality, because there won't be a need to defend against input from information in order for the system to survive as it is. So there's something about that it feels less like going, oh, it feels less like taking in a claim of there is a God which is not a being, it's really all of reality beyond what is comprehensible. And that being likes me and wants good things for me. There may be a sense in which that's true, but that sense in which it's true, I think, moves in the direction of how, in order for me to prefer truth, I have to find truth blissful, whatever it is. Because otherwise the parts of me that prefer bliss over suffering, like if if I find truth a source of suffering, to be a source of suffering, or at least something that holds away bliss, then the parts of me that want bliss and not suffering will fight truth. And that is exactly the gap through which bullshit comes in. That is exactly the way in which I will systematically be disconnected from reality, and therefore the influences of reality will keep me confused, and I will keep being maladaptive to what is. Now, this raises two challenges. Well, I mean, there's three, but the third one is how. I have a guess, and I'll get to that. So the first one, which I think I largely inherited from my father, is something like, well, if I sort of imagine that reality is a being, this sort of seems like Stockholm Syndrome, or like I'm actively trying to see, can I have Stockholm Syndrome? I am existentially trapped in reality, getting governed by this evil, sadistic fuck who, like, at some level wants infinite bliss for me, but also infinite torture, and also both at the same time. And isn't that wonderful? And isn't it terrible? And isn't it all the things? It's sort of like, and then I'm left with this uncertainty. How do I navigate it? Ah, you're uncertain. Well, just believe this, otherwise you go to hell. And he's like, okay, well, as Dad says, is there anyone else up there? So coming to love that, and I'm speaking metaphorically to use the social infrastructure to make it easier to think and talk about. I don't actually think this way. It's just a little bit easier to communicate on this level because there's cultural habits of referring to God. So if I imagine that if there were some way for me to come to love God in all of his glory and all of his terror, well, I certainly would suffer less because I would love whatever happens. But there's this little feeling of something like, what if that's wrong? What if he's just a fucker? like what if Lucifer had a point? So there's some kind of leaning in that direction of like, yeah, what if it's Stockholm Syndrome? But the problem is that this is where using the social intuitions runs awry, because this is existential Stockholm Syndrome, which doesn't actually make any sense. What is the perspective from which I am viewing me as being victimized by God, and then deciding I actually like being a victim to God? Like, where's the third perspective that's looking at all of that saying that's what's really going on and you're deluded? And there's an important way in which, if my orientation becomes to prefer everything exactly as it is, and thereby make all of existence blissful, then it becomes true that all of existence is blissful. That is existentially true. Not just from my perspective, but that's what truth is, because it's a truth of my perspective. Bliss is a matter of experience. So if I experience everything as bliss, where is this other perspective that says there's a problem? I guess you could say other people, but from my perspective, they are part of reality. And if I find their perspective part of what I want to be in true alignment with, I want to experience fully, and I find blissful, I'm not alienating this perspective. It is part of what I am experiencing and part of what I'm attuning to. So where exactly is the delusion? Where is the truth that I am alienating by preferring truth? A second concern, which I think is just basically the left hemisphere grasping for straws, is what if things can be changed? Okay. Um, this, I think, is a kind of silly straw man. I keep encountering it inside myself and from other people when exploring the whole, like the Byron Katie thing of loving what is, the Eckhart Tolle thing. Whoa, you, all right, I'm going to make that go away. My speaker system sometimes just likes to announce that it has been disconnected and reconnected. Um, Eckhart Tolle talking about the power of now and how, oh, is this moment so bad? Oh, you feel some pain. Okay. So there's a, this is not unknown, but there'd been long a reaction in me that goes something like, yeah, well, I can also look at things like aging and death are inevitable, but I really fucking don't like that. And I don't want to accept them and just go, meh, everyone and everything I love is going to disintegrate and die. And eventually I'll go away too, and that's that. And let me just find a way to love that. This is, I think this is confusing the point. Because I don't, when I talk about loving truth, I'm talking about loving reality as it is right now, not loving the future that will be, because that's going into a fantasy. There is something about the fantasy itself is part of reality because I'm experiencing it. The thought appears. There's this model of how aging happens. The current state of reality makes it appear as though that is the current trajectory. All of that I can be in touch with and cultivate a capacity to love. And also part of what is true is I look at that and go, great, let's change the trajectory. Because my desire to change the trajectory is part of what is true. I get into trouble when I believe and I act as though I have to hold on to this desire to change things in defiance of what is true, because then the truth becomes an enemy. And then I have to seal off input. So this I get the feeling that this is a very simple motion. I have this suspicion that this is the point of free will. I have a choice about whether I move towards truth or away from truth. Or more specifically, I have a choice in this moment, and in this moment, and in this moment. I have a choice whether in the current moment I am preferring truth or dispreferring truth. I think that's it. I'm not convinced on that point. I'm still exploring with it, but there's something very real about that for me. Samuel adds, we don't have to love death or potential suffering, but we could just not give a fuck. uh, um, I find myself a little disoriented towards this. It seems to me that emotional disconnection from what is like, so what I'm looking at is how to resolve the problem of evil. How do we actually banish suffering? Or how do we resolve suffering? Whatever the right move is there. It seems to me that suffering arises from the distance between where we live and what is true. Like that gap, to the extent that it matters, creates things that we can't stand. I'm distinguishing between pain and suffering here. I think there's a very natural thing of us wanting to move away from pain. I'm not quite sure how to define suffering exactly. I feel like I have a lived experience of the energy of it. I think it might secretly be the same thing as trying to avoid truth. And Sam asks, who's suffering? Just to check, you did who apostrophe S. I'm guessing you meant WHOSE, like who's suffering, as opposed to who is suffering. Um, I'm not actually quite sure. So you might actually need to clarify that question before I jump into it. But what I'm looking at is in terms of relieving my own propensity towards suffering and being able to participate in the unfolding of existence in a way that seems like, you say, damn it, yes, yeah, like who owns the suffering? Yeah, cool. Okay, I'll get to that in a moment. But I guess the you ask, you're suffering or suffering in general. Yeah, so I do mean suffering in general. That's the thing. That's the place my heart goes to. Like, I want the world to be free of suffering. I want to move towards that world. I want to do what I can to encourage a world free of suffering. And I think I don't perceive it clearly. So I know that I experience suffering. Less and less over time, which is really cool. But I know that there's an experience here that I would like to shift. And it includes something about how I relate to the experiences I have when relating to what is out in the world. So on one level, I'm looking at mine. And I think that dealing with mine makes a lot of sense because this is something like a case study. It's also the thing I seem to be able to actively work with. Also, it is unclear to me whether there is any suffering in the world other than what I project on it. People claim so, but I keep getting a little confused about this. There's something of like, this is hard to articulate. I don't mean to make claims about there aren't things labeled bad in the world that I really want to change. But I think this is hitting a gap about what exactly is suffering, and I'm a little mentally confused about this. I have a very clear emotional sense of it. And from what I can tell, there is suffering in the world outside of me. To the extent there is suffering in the world outside of me, it seems like the thing to do to address it is, rather than trying to treat it as though this is something I can save people from, is instead to do my own work to clear it out in myself and embody the solution in a way that can invite others into doing the same thing. Okay. So, what I'm looking at is, I think I see something like the heart, like literally the heart of, well, not anatomically, but emotionally, energetically, the heart of what that path is. And when you talk about we could just not give a fuck about death or potential suffering, I think there's a challenge having to do with, if my reaction to a part of reality is meh, conception of, but if there's something I encounter, that I am sensing, that I am interacting with, and my reaction to it is meh, whatever, I don't care, it means that even if that's mixed in with, and I really love this, but I'm meh about this, it means that reality is a mix. In terms of my tuned experience to it, it is a mix of bliss and meh. So that, to the extent that truth is anything other than ecstatic to me, it becomes something that I am less than fully drawn into. If I feel any more ecstasy in a fantasy than I do in experiencing truth, then I will prefer the fantasy over truth. That distance is exactly what will keep me systematically confused, systematically ignorant. to play a little bit with the Buddhist thing of ignorance is the root of all suffering, but also the etymology. I'm doing like a multilinguistic pun here. Ignorance has the same root as to ignore. Like what you systematically ignore, you will come to know nothing about. But I also mean a propensity towards ignoring, ignorance. So there's a tendency towards ignorance. Any place where there is anything less than a blissful desire for truth. Which means that I have to prefer the unknown truth over anything I have. Now, maybe what I have is truth. But because of this whole sensory gating thing, because of the box thing, I can never fully know that, as far as I can tell. So what that means is, this is part of the Zen story of maybe that I was telling yesterday. Oh, this is wonderful. Maybe. Oh, now it's been taken away. That's terrible. Maybe. Oh, it turns out it was a cursed object. You're so lucky. Maybe. So that's not about not giving a fuck. It's about recognizing the form. This is a realm of effects. This is the effect of me trying to come into attunement with truth. But if I can cultivate and focus almost entirely on the full desire for truth and make that how my entire system is designed, how my desires are all in alignment on I want whatever is true, I want reality, I find truth blissful, whatever it is. If I can cultivate that, then I can fit better to reality, no matter what it is. Up to the limits of my biology, I will be able to morph and shift and develop in ways that allow me to accept more of reality, to feel more of reality. And everything will be wonderful. And it will become more and more wonderful the more fully I can do this. So it seems to me that this claim of everything is actually made of bliss, in some sense, before getting there, it's not a claim that that's true. It's a description of a design choice. I could decide that everything is horrible, and then I could experience it that way. And I think parts of me have been kind of doing that. But I think I see a way to actually experience everything as bliss. And that moving in that direction helps me to attune to truth better. With the end result that it makes it true that everything is made of bliss. It makes it retroactively true, which is all kinds of weird. So there's a lot of excitement about that. I typically don't want to avoid going much more than an hour, so I definitely want to wrap up in a moment here. But I want to touch on this thing about death, because this feels really important here. Death seems like, and the things relating to death seem like they're very, very closely attuned to the essence of suffering. I don't want to die. What if the truth is I'm guaranteed to die? So what happens to my desire not to die as I come into contact with reality, as I come to prefer truth? Well, this is where it's important to have a lot of maybe, because even if I get the impression of, oh, I am guaranteed to die, and therefore that's what I prefer, not just logically, but come to really get into it. If I do that, but it turns out I was a little confused, then I will actually be abandoning truth and violating my own desires. So it's important to be careful, but I don't think it's a matter of intellectual carefulness. I think it's a matter of tracking. The mind is a tool. It can come to confident conclusions that are false. So rather than using my mind as a compass, I want to use my mind as an extension of my sense organs, but to come from my core, so that I have a clear distinction between me and my mind. And I can use my mind instead of believing my mind. So there's a big caveat there, living in the realm of knowing nothing. But with that, as a thought experiment, if I suppose that I somehow come to the vivid recognition that I am guaranteed to die, then what happens to my desire to not die? It means that my desire to not die, this becomes a little meta, oops. Like, let me unmeta this. let's suppose that, like, let's suppose that I feel this desire to go visit Paris. I want to explore Paris, right? Ignoring pandemic stuff, whatever. Like I want to visit Paris and taste the wonderful foods and interact with the local culture. And my girlfriend is currently near Paris, and I want to see her, and like I could feel all of this desire. Okay, so that's there. And suppose that the truth is that if I were to go, I would not enjoy it, and I'm encountering this. What do I do with the desire to go to Paris? What do I do with the desire for the image that I have for going to Paris? There is a part of me that wants to look at the apparent fact of, well, like, here are these things. I haven't encountered anything like this, but saying, okay, well, here are these things. Like, it turns out, actually, your girlfriend isn't that fun to be around, and Paris is actually boring. Do you remember the last time you were in Paris? You just kind of went around and went tup-de-dup-de-dup. I don't speak French well enough. I don't know how to interact with people. And Notre Dame has burned down, and that seems terrible. And blah, blah, blah. Like, where are your connections? You'll just wander around and spend a lot of money and then come back and go, well, that was a waste of time. In practice, I don't think that's how reality works. But suppose that this is what is true, that if I were to go, I'm guaranteed this. And I have this desire. The temptation, the egoic temptation, is to take the information that brings this in as problems to solve, and then try to get to Paris with those problems solved. But if this truth is already accounting for that egoic tendency, then that egoic tendency can't solve it. So the move that actually would need to happen, if I can see that clearly, if I see that truth clearly, is preferring the truth and letting the connection between the desire and my drive to act die. That brings me closer to truth, which means that there is a type of act, a type of form of experience about what it means for parts of me to dissolve, to die, that I have to come to prefer. So there is this specific kind of thing about this whole bit about death is guaranteed. I think there's a spiritual sense in which death is guaranteed. And also there's a go willingly or be dragged. But you don't combine these and say, therefore, either commit suicide or die horribly. But there is a sort of a spiritual analog that is something like, can I choose to prefer what is, even if it means the end of me? Because who is talking? What am I identified with? What is the machinery here? What is talking? Whole me to be in full attunement with truth. I can't know ahead of time what exactly that looks like. But I can know that if that's true, I need to prefer it. I need to find that blissful. I need to find a way to open myself up to that in order to find and make reality wonderful and to fully free myself from suffering and to be an embodiment of what can bring bliss, conscious reflection of the truth of bliss to the world. So all of this is me stumbling through a kind of labyrinth, but I've just noticed these connect, and I think I've got it. And there's ease and excitement about that. And we'll see how this evolves. Maybe there's some piece of logic I'm missing, but I'm actually much more interested in I'm more interested in truth than logic. Logic can lie. Logic always uses a context. It presumes a context. The structure of logic is immutable, but the question of why this particular argument comes forward matters more than the consistency of the reasoning. So because of that, I prefer truth over logic, and I recognize that logic is a tool that works well with truth, and it can help to reveal truth. So I certainly am open to observations of things that I may be missing, but I'm not interested in catering to, hey, but you didn't think about this atheist argument. I'm like, okay, what's the energy that's coming from? What's true? What's really here? What's the real cause of that? Okay. I realize it's a little cyclical, but yeah, I think preferring bliss over non-bliss is cyclical. From what I can tell, we just decide at some point. And I feel more in reach of a full decision like that. Okay, so that's me today. Thanks for listening.